The letter arrived on a Tuesday, folded so many times the creases had gone white, and when Mabel Conley unfolded it at the kitchen table of her dead father's house, the words inside changed the entire direction of her life. She read it twice, then a third time, smoothing the paper against the rough-hewn tabletop with hands that had grown calloused from 3 years of managing her father's affairs alone. The letter was from a lawyer in Abilene, Kansas, a man named Horace Pemberton, who wrote in the careful loops of a man who charged by the word. He informed her that one Gerald Conley, her father, had lent the sum of $800 to a cattle rancher by the name of Robert Shelby of Sweetwater Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, and that the debt had gone uncollected at the time of Gerald's passing. The lawyer further informed Mabel that as the sole heir of her father's estate, the debt was now hers to collect, and that if she wished to pursue the matter, she ought to do so soon, as the statute on such agreements was not indefinite. $800. In the year 1881, with the drought having taken most of what remained of her father's land value, and the bank holding a note against the house, $800 was not merely a sum of money. It was survival. Mabel folded the letter back along its worn creases and set it beside her cold cup of coffee. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned at the back of her neck because loose hair was impractical, and eyes the color of creek water after rain, a changeable gray-green that shifted with her mood. She was not a woman given to dramatic gestures or theatrical decisions. She was the kind of woman who made lists, who kept careful ledgers, who had spent the better part of her adult life learning to be steady in a world that seemed determined to knock her sideways. But $800. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer, dipped her pen, and began to write a response to Horace Pemberton. She would go to Sweetwater Creek herself. There was no one else, and frankly, she did not trust a lawyer she had never met to pursue the matter with any urgency on her behalf. She would take the train from Dodge City to Abilene, collect whatever documentation Pemberton had, and then continue south into Texas on the stage line. She told no one because there was no one to tell. Her father had been gone 14 months. She had no siblings. The neighbors were a mile off and mostly occupied with their own difficulties. She packed a single leather traveling case, 2 dresses, her father's old ledger book which she was bringing along as evidence of the loan, a small Derringer pistol that she kept because the world was what it was, and enough dried biscuits and salt pork to manage the journey without spending money she could not afford to spend. She locked the house, slipped the key into her coat pocket, and walked to the depot without looking back. The train ride to Abilene was long and rattling, the car smelling of coal smoke, and too many people pressed together against the October chill. Mabel sat with her case on her lap and watched Kansas flatten itself out the window, amber and wide under a sky that could not decide if it wanted to storm. The man beside her tried twice to start a conversation, and both times she answered in precisely enough words to be polite and not enough to encourage anything further. She was not unkind. She simply had a destination and a purpose, and pleasant conversation with strangers was not part of either. Horace Pemberton turned out to be a round little man with a magnificent mustache and the guilty expression of someone who had been putting off an unpleasant duty. He met her in his office above the dry goods store on Cedar Street, and he shook her hand with the faint surprise of a man who had expected someone smaller or possibly someone male. "Miss Conley," he said, "I am glad you've come. The matter has been sitting on my conscience for some time." "Then let us resolve it promptly," Mabel said, and sat down without being invited. Pemberton produced a copy of the loan agreement. It was in her father's handwriting, witnessed by 2 men whose names she did not recognize, and it specified the sum, the date, and the borrower's name clearly. Robert Shelby of the Shelby Ranch, Sweetwater Creek, Texas. The loan had been made in good faith, interest-free because, and here Pemberton paused, clearing his throat, because Robert Shelby's father and Gerald Conley had once been friends. Mabel studied the document. "Were they still friends when my father died?" I believe they had lost contact, Pemberton said carefully. There was some difficulty between them, the nature of which I was not made privy to. Your father asked me to hold the document and make no move toward collection during his lifetime. He had his reasons. He always did, Mabel said, which was neither praise nor complaint. She took the copy of the document and placed it carefully in her case. What is the current state of the Shelby operation? Is the man solvent enough to repay? Pemberton shuffled papers. From what I understand, the Shelby ranch has done reasonably well despite the hard years. Robert Shelby, the son, not the father who passed in 1879, has managed to keep the operation running. He runs a mixed outfit, cattle and some horses. I would not describe him as wealthy, but I do not believe him to be destitute. Then I shall go and collect what is owed, Mabel said. Can you recommend a reliable stage line south? Pemberton could and did, and also seemed to want to say something else that he could not quite bring himself to say. Mabel gave him time, watching him, and eventually he sighed through that magnificent mustache and leaned forward. Miss Conley, I feel I ought to warn you. Robert Shelby is, from the accounts I've received, a man of some strong feeling about this debt. He is aware of it. He has not been evading it precisely, but he has also made no move to address it. I am told he is not an easy man to deal with. Mr. Pemberton, Mabel said, picking up her case, I have been dealing with difficult things alone for 3 years. One stubborn rancher in Texas is unlikely to unsettle me. She said it with perfect confidence, and she meant it entirely, and she was wrong in ways she could not yet imagine. The stage line to Sweetwater Creek was 2 days of misery on bad roads through country that grew progressively more beautiful as it grew more desolate. The Texas sky was enormous and impersonal, the kind of sky that made a person feel simultaneously small, and if they were built a certain way, deeply alive. Mabel found herself leaning toward the window despite the dust that came in with every mile, watching the land change from the flat amber of the plains into something hillier and more complicated, cut through with dry creek beds and stands of cedar and live oak. The other passengers were a drummer named Collins who sold patent medicines and smelled strongly of his own product, an elderly Mexican woman named Senora Aguirre who was going to visit her daughter and who shared a bag of hard candies with Mabel without being asked, and a young cowhand of perhaps 19 who slept with his hat over his face for both entire days and whom nobody bothered, because he clearly needed the rest. Sweetwater Creek turned out to be larger than the name suggested. It was a genuine town by 1881 standards, with a main street long enough to contain a hotel, 3 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, a doctor's office, and a building that served as both the sheriff's office and the jail. The stage depot was at the far end of the street, and when Mabel stepped down from the coach with her traveling case, she stood for a moment in the afternoon light and simply looked at the place. It smelled of horses and dust and wood smoke. The street was unpaved and rutted from wagon wheels. A group of cowboys were visible outside one of the saloons, not causing trouble, just leaning and talking in the easy way men do when they have finished a long day and are not yet ready to begin the next thing. A woman in a faded blue dress was sweeping the porch of the general store. 2 dogs were conducting a detailed investigation of something near the water trough. Mabel went to the hotel first, because she was dusty and tired and needed to think clearly before she walked onto a man's property and asked him for $800. The hotel was called the Cattleman's Rest, which she found either ironic or appropriate depending on how the next few days went. The room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the back lot and a water pitcher on the dresser that was actually full. She washed her face and hands, changed into her better dress, the dark brown wool with the cream collar that made her look, she knew, somewhat more formidable than her other dress, which was a softer gray that made her look more approachable, and then sat at the small writing table by the window and opened her father's ledger. She had read this ledger many times over the past 14 months, trying to understand the full shape of what her father had left behind. Most of it was ordinary: crop yields, livestock sales, household expenses. But there were entries she had never fully understood, notations in her father's cramped hand that referenced transactions without fully explaining them. The loan to Robert Shelby's father, or was it to Robert himself, was noted in the spring of 1878, and beside it her father had written a single word that he sometimes used when he considered a matter settled by something other than money. The word was trust. Mabel closed the ledger and sat with that for a moment. She went downstairs and asked the hotel keeper, a lean woman of about 50 named Mrs. Gaines, whether she knew the Shelby ranch and how to reach it. Mrs. Gaines looked at her with the sharp-eyed assessment of a woman who has seen everything come through a small town and sorted it all into categories. "You here on business or personal?" "Business," Mabel said. "Shelby's place is about 4 miles east," Mrs. Gaines said. "You follow the creek road out past the Miller farm. There's a painted gate with a running horse on it. Can't miss it. You riding or walking?" "I'll need to hire a horse," Mabel said. Mrs. Gaines directed her to the livery, and the livery man, a quiet fellow named Arlo who communicated mostly in gestures, produced a sturdy bay mare of dependable temperament and not much beauty, which suited Mabel perfectly. She arranged to collect the horse in the morning and paid for 2 nights in advance with money she could barely spare. That night she lay in the narrow hotel bed and listened to the sounds of Sweetwater Creek settling into itself for the night. A piano from one of the saloons, distant and cheerful, the occasional whoop of laughter, a dog barking, then silence, then the wind off the plains that moved through the cedar trees with a sound like rushing water. She thought about what Pemberton had said. Not an easy man to deal with. She thought about her father's handwriting in the ledger, trust. She thought about $800 and the bank note against the house, and the way the cold had come through the kitchen wall last winter because she could not afford to have it properly repaired. She slept, eventually, the deep and dreamless sleep of a woman who has made her decision and is simply waiting for morning. The morning came in bright and cold, the October sun doing little to warm the air but making everything look precise and sharp-edged, like the land had been cut out with scissors. Mabel dressed carefully, pinned her hair with extra attention, and went down to eat a breakfast she paid for by calculating that it was cheaper than riding out on an empty stomach and making poor decisions from hunger. She had eggs and bread and coffee that was strong enough to be considered a structural material, and she ate it all with methodical attention. She collected the bay mare from Arlo, tied her traveling case across the back of the saddle, and followed Mrs. Gaines' directions east out of town along the creek road. The land opened up around her as she rode the creek, which was running, which was not guaranteed in October in Texas, visible through the trees to her right, the road lifting gently into low hills ahead. The air smelled of cedar and cold water and something else she could not name, some quality of the light and the land together that made her feel as though she was riding toward something rather than simply riding to a particular address. She found the painted gate easily enough. It was exactly as Mrs. Gaines had described. A tall gate of unpainted wood with a running horse rendered in white paint on the crossbar, spirited and competent looking, clearly done by someone with an eye. Past the gate, a road of red dirt wound up through cedar and live oak toward a cluster of buildings on a low rise. She went through the gate and up the road. The main house was larger than she had expected. Not grand by any Eastern standard, but solid and serious, built of limestone with a porch that ran the full length of the front, a house that had been put up to last by someone who planned to be there a long time. There were 2 bunkhouses to the east, a large barn, a stable, several corrals, a water tower, a smokehouse. The whole operation had an air of competent, unpretentious intention that Mabel recognized from her own upbringing. This was a working place, not a showing place. There were several horses in the near corral, and a man working with one of them who had not yet noticed her approach. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark canvas coat and a battered hat that had seen several serious discussions with the weather. He moved around the horse with the careful, specific attention of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and was fully present with it. She rode up to the fence and stopped the bay mare. "I am looking for Robert Shelby," she said. The man turned. She had expected someone older. For no reason she could clearly identify except that the situation felt old debts, old histories, old wounds. But the man who turned from the horse and looked up at her was, she guessed, close to her own age, perhaps a year or two older, 27 or 28. He had a face that had been outdoors in all weather for a long time, tanned and somewhat weathered, with lines at the corners of dark eyes that were currently looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. He had a good face. That was the thought she had, and then she set it aside because it was not relevant. "You found him," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not feel the need to fill silence. He took the measure of her with one direct look, the way someone looks at something they need to understand before they respond to it. "Who are you?" "My name is Mabel Conley," she said. "My father was Gerald Conley of Dodge City, Kansas. I have ridden out here to discuss a financial matter with you." Something shifted in his face. It was subtle, the kind of shift that a person who was not paying close attention would miss. But Mabel was always paying close attention, and what she saw was not guilt, exactly, and not resentment, exactly, but some complicated mixture of the two that included something she could not name, something that looked almost like pain. "Step down," he said after a moment. "I'll have someone take your horse." He did not say he was glad she was there. He did not say he had been expecting her. He turned and called toward the barn in a carrying voice, and a young hand came out and took her horse without ceremony, and Robert Shelby opened the gate and held it and waited for her to walk through. She walked through. They went to the house. The inside was clean in the way a house is clean when someone works at it consistently rather than with passion. No curtains on the windows, furniture that had been chosen for durability, a kitchen that showed evidence of actual use. There were books on a shelf by the fireplace, which she noted. There was a framed photograph on the mantel of a man and woman she did not recognize who must have been his parents. The fireplace was going and the room was warm. He did not offer her coffee, which she thought was deliberate, and she did not ask for any, which she thought he noticed. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, still in his coat, still in his hat, which was either rudeness or habit or the behavior of a man who needed to feel like he could leave at a moment's notice. She set her case on the table and took out the copy of the loan document and placed it in front of him without speaking. He looked at it. He did not touch it. $800, he said. "That is correct," she said. "Borrowed from my father in April of 1878. The original agreement was made with a verbal understanding that repayment would be arranged between the parties, but as you are aware, my father passed in August of 1880. The debt did not pass with him." "No," he said, "it did not." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the document. She watched him. The firelight shifted. "I know what I owe," he said, and his voice had gone very flat, not hostile but controlled, the voice of a man keeping something carefully contained. "I have not pretended otherwise." "Then why has it not been addressed?" she asked. He looked up at her then, and she had the sensation of walking through a door she had not seen and finding herself in a different room than she had expected. "Because your father and my father had an agreement that went beyond a piece of paper," he said. "And when my father died, I tried to contact yours to discuss the terms. I wrote 3 letters, Miss Conley, over 2 years. I received no response." Mabel said nothing immediately. She sat very still and let that settle. "I was not aware of those letters," she said after a careful pause. "No," he said, "I expect you weren't. Your father was not a man who shared everything he knew." That was true. That was, in fact, very precisely true, and the accuracy of it coming from a stranger made her jaw tighten slightly. "The nature of the arrangement between our fathers is not something I have full knowledge of," she said. "What I have is this document, which is legally clear. I would ask you to address it." "I can give you 200 now," he said, "and a note for the remaining 6 in installments over 18 months. She had expected this, or something like it, and she had prepared her response. The remaining sum would need to be addressed within 8 months, she said. I have financial obligations that require it. He studied her. 8 months is tight. Yes, she said, it is. Another silence. Outside, she could hear men at work in the yard, the sound of a hammer somewhere, horses in the corral. Can I ask what those obligations are? He said, and his tone had shifted slightly, some of the flatness easing, as if the conversation had moved from a formal register to something closer to human. She hesitated because it was not his business, and then said it anyway because she was tired and honest, and $800 was the whole of the matter. My father's house has a bank note against it. The bank has been patient, but patience has a schedule. If I cannot meet the terms, I lose the house. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "How much is the note?" "More than 800, she said. "But this would make a significant difference." He turned the document over in his hands, finally, turning it face down on the table and then face up again, a gesture that had nothing to do with reading it and everything to do with thinking. "I'll give you the 200 today," he said, "and I'll see what I can do about the rest by spring. But I cannot promise the full 600 in 8 months without knowing more about what this season brings." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the kind of looking that was not about attraction, not yet, but about assessment, two people in a difficult situation trying to determine the character of the person across the table, trying to figure out whether to trust or not. "That is not sufficient," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. I know that." He took his hat off, finally, and set it on the table beside the document, and without it he looked younger and somehow less defended. His dark hair was slightly pressed where the hat had sat. "Miss Conley, I am not trying to avoid this debt. I never have been. But my operation runs on a particular rhythm, and if I pull $600 out of it in a hard stretch, things go sideways for more than just me." "The men you employ," she said. "Yes," he said. She had not expected him to say that. She had expected him to talk about the ranch, about cattle prices, about the economics of the thing, not about the men. She looked at the document on the table between them, and then she looked at the man across from it, and something she had not anticipated happened. She began to see him as a person rather than a debtor. It was inconvenient. She set it aside. "Tell me about the 3 letters, she said. He looked at her with a question in his eyes. "You said you wrote 3 letters to my father," she said. "Tell me what was in them." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said slowly, as if he was handling something he normally kept put away, "The first letter was after my father died. I wrote to explain what had happened and to say that I intended to honor the debt. I asked your father what terms he would find acceptable. I got no answer. The second letter I wrote about 8 months later. I told him I had set aside $200 and asked again what he would accept by way of schedule. No answer. The third letter I wrote in the spring of 1880, and that one was less careful." He paused. "I told him that I thought the silence was unkind, given that our fathers had been friends, and that I had done everything right in this situation, and I did not understand why he would not respond." Mabel felt something happen to the inside of her chest that she did not immediately classify. Her father had been a complicated man. She loved him, had loved him, but she had never been unaware of his complications. "I see," she said. "I'm not saying this to make you feel badly about him," Robert Shelby said carefully. "I am saying it because I want you to understand that the silence was not on my end." "I understand that now," she said. They looked at each other. "Stay for lunch," he said. "My cook does a decent midday meal and you've ridden 4 miles. Give me a chance to show you what we're working with here, and we can talk through the numbers more carefully this afternoon." It was a reasonable offer. It was also, she recognized, a strategic one, a way to slow the conversation down, to put it in a different context. But she was, in fact, hungry, and the bay mare needed rest before the ride back, and she had not ridden 4 miles to reach an impasse on the first morning. "All right," she said. Lunch was beans and cornbread and venison stew made by a man named Ernesto, who ran the cook shack with the quiet authority of someone who took his work very seriously. They ate at the long table in the main house, just the two of them, the hands eating in the cook's shack, and the conversation moved away from money for a little while and into other territory, the kind of ranging, testing conversation that two intelligent people have when they are starting to be curious about each other and are not sure whether they should be. He asked about Dodge City. She told him about it, and about her father's farm, and about the years she had spent managing it. She asked about the Shelby Ranch, and he told her about inheriting it at 25 when his father died of a fever that moved too fast for the doctor to catch up with it. That must have been hard, she said. It was, he said, without elaboration, and she understood that this was not a man who made a performance of his difficulties, and that suited her very well. After lunch, he offered to show her the operation, and she accepted again, because she had decided that knowing more rather than less was always the better position, and because she had noticed something about Robert Shelby that she needed more time to confirm or deny. She had noticed that he was not what she had expected. He showed her the cattle in the south pasture, 340 head of good mixed stock that had come through the summer drought in reasonable shape, because he had managed the water carefully. He showed her the string of horses he was developing, which turned out to be the thing he was most quietly proud of, a line of Mustang crosses that he had been working on for 3 years, strong and manageable, suited to the country. The cattle are the income, he said, leaning on the corral fence and watching the horses move. The horses are the future. What do you mean? She asked. Cattle ranching is going to change, he said. The open range is closing. Barbed wire is coming whether anyone wants it or not. But good horses, working horses, horses that can handle real country, there's always going to be a market for those. He glanced at her. Does that seem farsighted or foolish to you? She considered it honestly. Neither, she said. It seems practical. You're planning ahead of the current situation rather than for it. He looked at her for a moment with something new in his expression, a look that was slightly startled, as if he had said something he did not always say aloud and had not expected a direct and useful response. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. They walked back toward the house as the afternoon light began to angle lower and turn golden. The shadows of the cedar trees stretched long across the red dirt. The wind had dropped and the air was perfectly still, that particular stillness that comes in the late afternoon in Texas before the temperature drops. I need to get back to town before dark, Mabel said. I know, he said. They stood on the porch and he said, come back tomorrow. I'll have the ledger books ready and we can work through the actual numbers. I want you to see what's real rather than what I tell you is real. You deserve that. She looked at him. The afternoon light was on his face, and his dark eyes were direct and serious, and something else that she was making a decision not to examine too closely right now. All right, she said, for the 3rd time that day, and she collected her horse from the young hand who had been minding it, and rode back down the red dirt road under the painted gate with the running horse. She did not look back. She wanted to, and that was the thing she thought about all the way back to Sweetwater Creek, the bay mare's hooves steady on the road, and the long Texas sunset spreading itself across the sky in colors that were honestly excessive for a Tuesday. She went back the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the 4th morning it had stopped feeling like a formal visit and had started feeling like something she could not categorize. He kept his word about the ledger books. They were meticulous, carefully kept, the handwriting changing over time in a way that showed him learning it as he went. His father's entries first, precise and practiced, and then his own, a little rougher initially and then finding their rhythm. She went through 3 seasons with him at the table, he explaining, she asking questions, both of them doing arithmetic on paper because it was the kind of problem that needed to be seen to be understood. The ranch was in better shape than she had feared and more complex than she had assumed. He was not a rich man, but he was not a man in trouble either. He was a man who was building something carefully, who had taken on a debt that belonged to his father's history and was navigating it with as much integrity as the situation allowed. On the 4th morning when she arrived, he met her at the gate on horseback, which was new, and said, I want to show you the north pasture. It'll take an hour there and back, but I think you'll want to see it." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I found something," he said. "Something that changes the conversation about the debt." She rode with him. The north pasture was a long way from the main buildings, past the creek and up through a draw that opened onto a wide, flat expanse of grass that was, even in October, remarkably green. The creek came through the corner of the pasture from an underground spring, which was the reason for the green. "My father bought this piece 5 years before he died," Robert said. "He paid $300 for it. He never said much about why, only that it would matter later." Mabel looked at the pasture. "It matters now," she said. "With this spring you could run water to the rest of the property without depending on rain." "Yes," he said, "and that's not all." He dismounted and walked to the edge of the creek, and she dismounted and followed, and he crouched down and lifted a piece of rock from the creek bed and held it out to her. She took it, turned it in her hand, looked at the yellow lines running through it. "That's not," she began. "It's consistent through the whole length of this stretch of creek," he said. "I had a man look at it in September. He said it's a real deposit, possibly a significant one." She stood very still with the rock in her hand. "Gold, in this creek. On this land. This changes things considerably," she said. "It does," he said. He was watching her with that direct, careful look that she had come to recognize over 4 days as his standard expression for things that mattered to him. "I have not told anyone else. I'm not sure yet what I intend to do about it. Mining is not what I built here. But it could settle the debt," she said, because she was an honest person, and that was the first thing that came to mind. "It could," he said. "Eventually. It would take time to develop." But Miss Conley, Mabel, it was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed strangely, warmly in the cold air. "I wanted you to know because you came here on honest terms, and I think you deserve honest information." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why does it matter to you that I have honest information? Most men in your position would simply negotiate." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she had not expected and that she could not easily set aside. "Because you remind me of someone I respect a great deal," he said. "Yourself. You remind me of how you've handled all of this, what you're dealing with, what you've been managing alone, how clearly you see things. And I don't want to be less than that." She did not know what to say to that. She was not often without words. She looked at the rock in her hand, at the yellow threads running through the gray stone, and she felt the October sun on her face and the October wind off the plains, and she was aware, for the first time since she had stepped off the stage in Sweetwater Creek, that something had happened that had nothing to do with $800. She handed the rock back to him. "We should discuss the practical path forward," she said. "Yes," he said, and he was almost smiling, just barely, a small and private thing at the corner of his mouth. "We should." They rode back to the ranch house, and they spent the rest of the morning at the table with the ledger books and paper and numbers, and by noon they had worked out an agreement. He would pay the $200 immediately, and the remaining $600 would be secured against the land itself. Specifically, the north pasture with the creek and the gold deposit as collateral with a clear 12-month schedule. If the deposit proved valuable enough, it would be settled early. If not, the land note would cover it. It was a good agreement. It was fair in both directions. Mabel copied it out twice in clear handwriting, and they both signed both copies, and she noticed that his signature was quick and confident, the signature of a man who did not second-guess himself. She should have gone back to town. The business was settled, or at least formally arranged, and there was no practical reason to linger. The bank could be managed now that she had a legal note in hand. She should collect her $200, take the stage back north, write to Pemberton with the update, and get on with the business of her life. She stayed 3 more days. She told herself it was prudent to remain long enough to ensure there were no complications with the note. She told herself it was practical to learn more about the situation. She told herself a great many things that were technically true and not entirely the reason. On the 5th day, he asked her to ride with him to check on cattle in the eastern pasture, and she went. and they rode for 2 hours through country that was so beautiful it was almost argument against efficiency. Big limestone outcroppings and cedar thickets and hawks doing slow circles in a sky so blue it seemed improbable. They talked with the ease of people who have gotten past the formal stage and discovered that they can simply speak to each other, about anything, about nothing, and that it is pleasant. He told her about growing up on this land, about his father who had been exacting and demanding, and had also been the most competent man he had ever known. He told her about learning to ride before he could manage a full day's work, about the summer he was 16, and they had driven cattle all the way to Abilene, and he had felt, for the first time, that the world was very large and full of possibility. She told him about her mother, who had died when Mabel was 11, and about how she had become her father's closest companion by necessity and then by genuine choice. About the ledger books she had kept from the age of 12. About the reading she had done, everything she could get, history and agriculture and law and anything else that came through Dodge City in printed form, because she had understood early that knowledge was the best tool a woman in her position could have. "Your father must have been proud of you," he said. "He was," she said, and then, "he was also complicated, in the way that people who love you are sometimes complicated." "Yes," he said simply, as if he knew exactly what that meant, and she thought he probably did. On the 6th morning, she came down to breakfast at the hotel and found a folded note that had been left at the desk for her. She opened it and read, "I know this is an unusual invitation and you are welcome to decline it, but I am going into town this morning to collect supplies and then continuing to the Miller farm to deliver some timber we have spare. If you would like company on the road, I'll be outside the hotel at 9 o'clock. R.S." She looked at the note for a moment, then folded it and put it in her pocket. She was outside the hotel at 9 o'clock. He was there with a wagon and a team of matched bays, and he looked genuinely pleased when she came through the door, pleased in a way that he did not try to conceal and that she felt somewhere below her sternum. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said, which was not precisely what the note had established, but it was what she had decided. The morning was the kind of morning that seems to have been arranged specifically for the benefit of two people who need something to talk about that is not a debt agreement or the situation of their respective lives. The light was clean and cool, the road dry, the team moving at a good steady pace. The town was busy for a Saturday, and they stopped at the general store, and she helped him load supplies into the wagon bed while Mrs. Patterson, who ran the store, gave Mabel the kind of measured look that small-town women give to strangers who show up in the company of eligible men, a look that was partly interested and partly protective and partly just curious. "You're the Conley woman," Mrs. Patterson said. "From Kansas." "I am," Mabel said pleasantly. "How long are you staying?" "I haven't quite decided," Mabel said, and smiled, and moved a 50-pound flour sack before Mrs. Patterson could make anything further of that, and she could hear Robert very quietly laughing somewhere behind her. They drove out to the Miller farm, which turned out to be a modest operation run by a widow named Eliza Miller and her two grown sons, Sam and Thomas. The Millers were clearly glad of the timber. They had lost a barn wall in a summer storm and had not had the means to repair it fully. Robert unloaded the timber with Sam and Thomas, and Mabel sat with Eliza Miller on the porch and drank coffee and talked in the comfortable way that women talk when they are both sensible and have enough in common to find a rhythm quickly. "He does this sort of thing regularly," Eliza said, nodding toward where Robert and her sons were working. "Brings things out when he is spare. Never makes a production of it." Mabel watched Robert hoist a beam with Sam Miller, the two of them moving it with the practiced ease of men doing heavy work together. "He seems like a good neighbor," she said carefully. Eliza gave her a look. "He's a good man," she said with the precision of someone making a specific point. "There are not as many as you'd think out here or anywhere, I expect." Mabel looked into her coffee cup. "No," she said, "I expect not." On the drive back to Sweetwater Creek, The afternoon light was doing what it did in Texas in October, going long and gold, and spreading itself generously across everything it touched. Mabel sat beside him on the wagon seat with 3 inches of space between them that felt somehow charged, the way air feels before lightning. "I have to go home soon," she said. He did not answer immediately. The team moved on the road and the wheels turned and the cedar trees went past. "I know," he said. "The note is in order. There's no reason to stay longer." She said it straight because she was a straight person and because saying it was the honest thing and she preferred honesty even when it was inconvenient. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Is there no reason, or is there a reason that you're not sure what to do about?" She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road, but his jaw was set in a way that suggested the question had cost him something, and he was waiting to see if it had been a mistake. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the road ahead, at the long light on the red dirt, at the painted gate in the distance with its running horse. "The latter," she said finally. He turned his head and looked at her, and the look on his face was something she had no precedent for, not in her experience of men, not in the books she had read, not in the stories she had heard. It was open and careful and warm and a little afraid, and it was the most honest face she had ever seen. "I would like you to stay a while longer," he said. "If you could manage it. I am not asking you to stay forever. I am asking you to stay long enough for us to know what this is." "And what do you think this is?" she asked. "I think," he said, slowly and with care, "that you came here for $800, and I came out to that gate to send you away with a note and a firm schedule. And instead I find that I am sitting next to you on a wagon seat at 4 in the afternoon, wanting very much not to reach town." She felt the corners of her mouth move. "That is a very specific observation." "I am a specific person," he said, and now he was almost smiling too, and the 3 inches of space between them felt like an extraordinary effort. "I can stay another week," she said. "After that I have to go. The house, the bank, I understand," he said. "A week." "A week," she agreed. The week was the most alive Mabel Conley had felt in years, possibly ever. She had not known she was lonely until she was no longer lonely. She had not known how much she had been holding herself in careful check, managing and measuring everything, until she was with someone who did not require that of her. Robert Shelby did not require her to be smaller or simpler or less than she was. He did not seem surprised by her opinions, or unsettled by the directness of her thinking, or anxious about the fact that she knew what she was talking about in most of the conversations they had. He showed her things about the ranch she had not yet seen, the spring-fed water system he was engineering, the careful records he kept of the horse breeding program, the plans he was developing for what would happen if the gold deposit proved viable. She showed him things she had not shown anyone. The habit of precise thought she had developed from years of necessity, the particular way she saw a problem as a system with variables rather than a fixed obstacle. They sat at his table in the evenings after supper and talked about things that had nothing to do with either of their situations, about the direction of the country, about the books she had read and the ones he had read, about what a person needed to feel that their life was worth the effort. "What do you need?" he asked her one evening, not in the abstract, directly. She thought about it honestly. "Stability," she said. "And honesty and work that means something." She looked at him. "And company that doesn't require me to be something I'm not." "Yes," he said, and the way he said it was quiet and certain and meant entirely for her. On the 8th evening, he walked her back from the ranch to town. She had been riding out each day and returning each evening, and they stood at the door of the Cattleman's Rest in the blue dusk with the street quiet around them and the lamps lit in the windows and a coyote calling somewhere far off in the hills. "I don't want you to go back to a house with a bank note on it and no one in it," he said. "It's my house," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I'm not arguing about the house." She looked at him. The lamplight from the hotel window was on his face, and he was looking at her with that open, careful look, and she understood that they had arrived at a moment that required a decision. "Robert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him register it, saw the slight change in his face that it caused. "I came here to collect a debt." "I know," he said. "I did not come here for anything else." "No," he said, "but something else has happened." "Yes," he said, "it has." She looked at him for a long moment in the blue evening. This man she had known 8 days, this man who had been a name on a document and had become something considerably more complicated and considerably more important than that. "You owe me nothing," she said slowly. "The note is signed, the agreement is clear, and I expect you to honor it on the schedule we set. That is a business matter, and it is separate." "Completely separate," he agreed. "So whatever this is," she said, gesturing between them in a way that was perhaps not her most articulate moment, "it is not about the money." "It has nothing to do with the money," he said firmly. "Miss Conley, Mabel, I have spent 8 days trying to find the thing wrong with you because I was determined not to be in this position, and I could not find it, and I have given up trying." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh unheld, the kind she had not produced in quite a while. "That is the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I am not a romantic man," he said, and there was a smile now fully visible, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, made him look younger and warmer and somehow even more himself. "I am a practical man who is telling you something true." "What are you telling me specifically?" she asked. He took a breath. "I am telling you that I would like very much to know you better, that I would like to write to you if you'll let me, that I would like to come to Dodge City if you'd allow it, that I think," he paused, "that I think I could be very happy with you, and I think you might be happy with me, and I would like the chance to find out." She held his gaze. The coyote called again, closer now, a sound like longing made audible. "I will think about it," she said, which was her honest answer, and he accepted it because he was, as he had said, a practical man who recognized an honest answer when he heard one. She went back to her room and lay on the narrow hotel bed and did, in fact, think about it. She thought about the house with the bank note. She thought about the years alone. She thought about the ledger books and the letter and the long train ride and the bay mare and the painted gate and the gold in the creek and the man who had written 3 letters and received no answer and had kept his word anyway. She thought about what it meant to come looking for something that was owed and find something entirely different on the other side of that search. She thought about the word her father had written in the ledger beside the entry for $800, trust. She thought about Robert Shelby's face in the lamplight, and the way he had said her name, and the fact that she had laughed at the hotel door and meant it. She got up and went to the writing table, and by the light of the small lamp wrote a letter to the bank in Dodge City, explaining that she had secured a note against the debt owed her father's estate, and would be returning within a fortnight, and would be in contact shortly thereafter with a schedule for addressing the account. She wrote it with precision and care, and the calm confidence of a woman who has handled difficult things successfully. Then she wrote a second letter, shorter, to her neighbor a mile off, asking him to check on the house every few days until her return. She sealed it and addressed it. Then she folded her hands on the table and sat for a moment and made a decision that was not hard, once she allowed herself to make it. In the morning she went to find him. He was where she had first seen him, at the corral with a horse, moving with that careful specific attention that she had noticed the very first day. He heard her horse and turned, and when he saw her coming through the gate the expression on his face was one she would carry for a long time. "I've been thinking," she said. And he said. He was very still, holding the lead rope, the horse quiet beside him. "Yes to the letters," she said. "Yes to the visit," she paused, "and perhaps yes to the rest of it if the letters and the visit go as I expect they will." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "How do you expect them to go?" "Well," she said, "I expect them to go very well." He smiled then, the full smile, and it was extraordinary, and she was glad she had come back in the morning rather than waiting until she left. She went home 3 days later. He drove her to the stage depot himself in the wagon with the matched bays, and the town took note of this, which neither of them addressed and both of them understood. He handed up her traveling case and then stood beside the wagon and looked at her in the stage, and she looked at him. "Right soon," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. The stage pulled out and she watched him standing in the street until the road bent and he was gone, and she sat back against the seat and felt the strange doubled sensation of leaving something and moving toward it at the same time. The journey home was easier than the journey out, not because it was more comfortable, but because she was not the same person who had made it in the first direction. She had the signed note in her case. She had $200 in the traveling case's inside pocket. She had, considerably more unexpectedly, a reason to check the mail every morning. He wrote on the second day, not the first, because he had said tomorrow and then been delayed by a horse that needed attention, which he explained at the beginning of the letter with such direct, matter-of-fact practicality that she smiled for the first 10 minutes of reading it. The letter was 4 pages, written in his competent, slightly informal hand, and it covered the developments at the ranch, the weather, a discussion of a book he had been reading about land management that she had mentioned during one of their evenings, and at the very end, in a paragraph that was briefer and more careful than everything preceding it, a statement that he thought about their conversations often and found himself looking forward to her reply more than he had looked forward to most things in recent memory. She wrote back the same evening she received it. Her letter was also 4 pages. She told him about the bank meeting, which had gone satisfactorily. She told him about the neighbor who had checked the house and reported that everything was as she had left it. She told him about the book she was currently reading and what she thought of it, and what questions it raised that she did not have answers to. And at the end, in a paragraph she wrote 3 times before she found the version she was willing to send, she told him that she had not expected October in Texas to change anything essential about her life, and that she appeared to have been wrong. They wrote for 2 months, letters crossing in the mail, both of them finding their rhythm in it, the specific pleasure of written conversation with someone you are thinking about more than you have said. The letters grew longer and then more comfortable, settling into a frequency and depth that felt natural, like water finding its level. He came to Dodge City in December, on a Saturday, 2 weeks before Christmas. She knew which day he was arriving and went to the depot, which was either a romantic gesture or a practical one. She told herself it was practical. When he stepped off the train, he looked around and found her standing on the platform in her brown wool dress with the cream collar, her hair in its customary pin position, and his face did the thing it did that she had missed without realizing how much she had missed it. He crossed the platform and shook her hand because it was a public place and 1881 had its proprieties, and the handshake was brief, and his hand was warm, and she thought, with great clarity, yes. She showed him Dodge City. She showed him the house, which he walked through quietly, looking at things, not commenting unless she explained something, respectful of the space and what it meant to her. He met her neighbor, whose name was Harding, a solid widower of about 50 who had clearly been keeping a protective eye on the property, and who looked at Robert with the measuring attention of a man standing in for family and took some time to be reassured, though not very long. They had Christmas dinner with the Hardings because Mrs. Harding, who was very much alive and very much the person who had made the invitation, insisted, and it was a good evening, loud and warm and full of the particular pleasure of gathered people in a warm house when the world outside is cold. He stayed 4 days, which was as long as the ranch could spare him in December, and on the last evening he walked her home from the Hardings and they stood on her porch in the cold under a sky full of stars, and he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can say no, and I will continue to write letters and come back in the spring, and I will not make it difficult." "Ask," she said. "Will you come back to Sweetwater Creek?" he said. "Not to collect anything. Not for any practical reason, because I want you there, because I think you want to be there. Because I believe we could build something very good together, and I would rather start building it sooner than later." She looked at him. The stars were extraordinary in the Kansas winter, flat and brilliant and very far away. The porch boards were solid under her feet, the boards she knew, the house she had grown up in and fought for and managed alone. "I would need to sell the house," she said. "I know," he said. "The bank note is manageable now," he said. "The first installment comes in February. And by spring, if the Creek deposit continues to look the way it looks, there'll be more." "I don't want to come because of that," she said firmly. "I know that too," he said. "That is not why I am asking." She looked at the house, at the dark windows and the solid walls and the life that was inside them, the life she had built alone, the life that was entirely hers. She thought about what you lose when you leave a place and what you might find when you go to another one. She thought about the word her father had written in the ledger beside $800. "Let me sell the house first," she said. "Let me do this in the right order. Let me close what I have here before I open what might be there." "Yes," he said, "whatever order you need." "And Robert," she said, and he looked at her very carefully, "I'm not coming to be provided for. I'm not coming to be managed or maintained. If I come, it's as a partner." "I know what you are," he said. "I would not have it any other way." She nodded slowly. "Then yes," she said, "I will come back to Sweetwater Creek." He exhaled, a quiet breath of something that was clearly relief and something warmer than that, and he took a step toward her on the porch in the cold December night, and she took a step toward him, and then they were close enough that she could see his face clearly in the starlight, and she thought, for the last time with surprise, yes. He kissed her. It was quiet and careful and entirely serious, the kiss of a man who does not do things carelessly, and she felt it through the whole of her, through the cold air and the brown wool and the years of careful, measured living alone. She kissed him back, with equal seriousness and rather more warmth than either of them had publicly accounted for, and the Kansas winter did not object. He left the next morning on the early train, and she stood on the platform again and watched him go. And this time the train disappeared toward the south rather than the north, and she turned and walked back through Dodge City with her hands in her coat pockets and a sense of ordered calm that was entirely genuine. She sold the house in February. The buyer was a family newly arrived from Missouri, a young couple with 2 small children and a hopeful manner, and Mabel felt, watching them walk through the rooms, that this was the right conclusion to the house's history. She sold most of the furniture, kept the books, kept her father's ledger, kept the cream-collar dress and the gray dress and the practical clothing and the small derringer and the traveling case, and she packed everything that was hers into 2 trunks and sent them ahead on the freight line. She wrote to Robert that she was coming on the 15th of March, and she received a letter back that was brief and entirely in character. "I will be at the depot." He was at the depot. He was leaning against the station building with his hat pushed back and his arms folded, watching the train come in, and when she stepped onto the platform he straightened and came toward her, and this time he did not shake her hand. He took her hands in both of his and held them and looked at her with a look that did not need any words. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said, for the second time in their acquaintance, and he laughed, the warm and full laugh she had not heard very much but treasured each time. He had told no one because she had asked him not to, but the town took note anyway, because small towns always do, and as they drove out the creek road in the wagon with the matched bays, people noticed, and some of them smiled, and Mrs. Gaines at the Cattleman's Rest watched from the doorway with the sharp-eyed satisfaction of a woman who was not surprised. The ranch looked different in March. The winter had been relatively mild, as Texas winters sometimes are, and the grass was beginning to green again, and the creek was running strong from the winter rains, and the horses in the corral looked fat and well and pleased with things generally. The limestone house was warm and solid in the morning light. He had arranged the room she would use with the particular awkward care of a man who had done his best with something he was not sure he had gotten right. Clean linens, a pitcher of water, a small bunch of early wildflowers in a glass on the writing table that must have required someone to go searching in the fields. She set down her smaller bag and looked at the wildflowers. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I wanted to." She turned and looked at him standing in the doorway, this man whose life she had walked into looking for $800 and found something she did not have a ledger category for, something that did not reduce to a number or a debt or a transaction of any kind. "Robert," she said. "Mabel," he said. She crossed the room and he met her in the middle, because that was the character of both of them, and he put his arms around her and she let herself be held in the solid, serious, entirely real way of a man who does not do things for display, and she thought, this is what was at the other end of that letter. They were married in May, in the small white church on the main street of Sweetwater Creek, by Reverend Alcott, who had been doing these things for 20 years, and who managed the ceremony with the right balance of solemnity and warmth. Eliza Miller stood with Mabel as her witness, because they had become friends in the months between December and May, the kind of friends that happen quickly when two women of similar intelligence and situation find each other. Sam and Thomas Miller stood with Robert. The church was full. Mabel had not expected the church to be full. She had not expected to feel the collective goodwill of a town she had arrived in as a stranger collecting a debt. But it was there, real and warm, in the faces of the people who had watched Robert Shelby manage this ranch alone for 2 years and had clearly wanted something better for him, and who seemed to have decided, in the way of small towns, that Mabel Conley was sufficient. She wore a dress she had made herself from the finest fabric available in the Sweetwater Creek General Store, a deep blue that Mrs. Patterson had ordered in from San Antonio, and she had her hair down for the occasion, which she almost never did, and Robert, when he saw her, looked at her for a long moment before he remembered to breathe. The ceremony was simple. The vows were the standard ones of the time, said by both of them with the direct simplicity of two people who mean exactly what they are saying and have no need to perform it. When it was done, they walked out of the church into the May sunshine to a celebration that the town had apparently organized without being asked. Tables set up in the street, food contributed from various households, the fiddle player from the saloon playing with considerably more propriety than his usual venue required. Ernesto had made an extraordinary quantity of food, and the Millers had brought wine that someone's cousin had made somewhere in the hill country, and the whole afternoon was full of laughter and sunlight, and the particular happiness that takes you by surprise because you did not quite know you were building toward it. In the evening, when the celebration had wound down and the last guests had gone and Ernesto and the ranch hands had tidied up and gone to their bunkhouse with the tactful purpose of men who understand certain situations, Mabel and Robert sat on the porch of the limestone house in the blue dusk and listened to the creek. "I think I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For making this complicated," he said. "For the months of letters and back and forth." "I should have said plainly sooner what I meant." "You said it exactly as soon as you were sure of it," she said. "Which is the right time?" He looked at her. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Find the right thing to say," he said. "I think clearly," she said. "It's really just that." He reached over and took her hand, which was on the arm of her chair, and held it without any self-consciousness or announcement, the natural gesture of a man who had decided something and was simply acting on it. She turned her hand and held his back. They sat on the porch for a long time in the evening, listening to the creek and the cedar trees and the horses settling for the night. And the stars came out one by one and then all at once. And the coyotes called in the hills. And it was Texas in May, and the world was full and quiet and very good. In the following months, Mabel became a genuine part of the ranch's operation, not because anyone asked her to, but because she could not help it and Robert did not want to stop her. She brought her habits of clear-eyed accounting and systematic thinking to a place that already ran well and discovered, with enormous satisfaction, that it could run considerably better. She reorganized the supply ordering to reduce cost without sacrificing quality. She opened a correspondence with a horse buyer in San Antonio that proved remarkably profitable for the horse program. She made friends with Eliza Miller and Mrs. Patterson and the doctor's wife, a sharp and funny woman named Clara Briggs who had come to Texas from Georgia and had strong opinions about everything, which suited Mabel perfectly. She did not forget the injustice she had seen on her journey, and because she did not forget things, she did not let it pass without remark. She had seen, on her stage journey south and in the months in Sweetwater Creek, the particular difficulties of the Mexican families and families of color who worked and lived in this country, and were treated with a casual exclusion that was so ordinary no one seemed to notice it. Mabel noticed. She raised it with Robert directly, because she did everything directly. He listened and said, "What do you think should be done?" she said. "I think Ernesto should be paid the same as the other hands because he works more and manages more. I think the families on the south side of the creek should have the same access to the spring water you're developing. I think it starts with small things that are simply the right things." He made the changes without argument or drama. Ernesto received the increase in his pay with a reserve that concealed what Mabel suspected was genuine surprise, and then a few weeks later expressed his gratitude by preparing a Sunday meal of such extravagance and quality that the whole ranch ate in stunned appreciation. The gold deposit, properly evaluated by a man from the mining office in Austin who came out in the summer, proved to be a real and workable vein of modest but genuine value. Robert made the decision, after extensive discussion with Mabel, to develop it cautiously, bringing in a small and carefully managed operation that did not disrupt the ranch's primary function, but provided an additional income stream that, over the course of the next 2 years, would more than justify the North Pasture's price. The debt was paid in full by October, a year after Mabel had first ridden through the painted gate. She noted it in the ledger she kept for the ranch, the same ledger book she had brought from Dodge City, her father's original, which she had begun using for the combined operation with the same careful hand, and a satisfaction that was both professional and deeply personal. She sat back in her chair after writing the final entry and looked at the page, at the figures that closed the account, and she thought about the letter that had started everything, folded so many times the creases had gone white, arriving on a Tuesday that had changed the direction of her life. "Done," Robert said. He was by the fire with a book, reading in the particular contented way of a man who has found his peace, looking up with that direct, warm attention. "Done," she said, "fully settled." He closed his book and came to the desk and looked over her shoulder at the ledger, and then he straightened and looked at her and said quietly, "Your father did us a favor." "Yes," she said, "I think he did." He put his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the fire-lit room with the October wind in the cedar trees outside, and the horse program running strong and the gold in the creek, and the debt at last and fully closed. Their first child was born the following November, a boy they named Gerald James Shelby, Gerald for her father and James for his, and he arrived in the world with the determined and vocal urgency of a person who has a great deal to accomplish and is not inclined to wait. He had his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's dark hair, and a set of lungs that Ernesto declared audible from the cook shack. Robert held his son in the lamplight of the bedroom in the limestone house, with the sounds of Sweetwater Creek all around them, and looked at Mabel with a look that she had never seen on him before, something beyond the careful and the warm and the direct, something that had no precedent in his face and that she felt in the whole of herself. "You came here for $800, he said. "I did," she said. She was tired and happy, profoundly tired in the deep physical way of a woman who has just done the hardest work of her life, and profoundly happy in a way that was equally physical and went considerably beyond it. "I would have paid $10,000, he said, "to make this happen." She laughed. You couldn't afford 10,000. No, he said, but the principle stands. She smiled at him, at this man who was specific and practical and true, this man she had found at the end of a document and the other side of a long ride in 8 days that had changed everything. She had come to collect what was owed. She had found something that no ledger could hold. You didn't owe me anything, she said. Not really, not what matters. No, he said gently, looking down at their son and then back at her. But I'll spend the rest of my life paying it anyway. Outside, the November wind moved through the cedar trees, and the creek ran clear over the gold in its bed, and the horses stood quiet in the corral, and the painted gate at the end of the red dirt road held its running horse steady against the sky, and in the limestone house that had been built to last, the night settled warm and deep and perfectly, completely whole. The months that followed were full in the way that life becomes full when it has found its proper shape. Mabel managed the accounts and correspondence with an efficiency that freed Robert to focus on the cattle and horses with undivided attention, and the result was an operation that ran better than either of them had managed alone. Gerald grew fast and loud and curious, pulling himself to standing before most children his age, and regarding the world with the evaluating gray-green eyes of a boy who was going to need careful watching. Eliza Miller came by twice a week, and Clara Briggs came when her husband's schedule allowed, and the 3 women formed the kind of friendship that is its own kind of infrastructure, holding things up without being asked, and being the first and best people to call on when something went sideways. When the Miller farm lost a water pump in a dry spring, Mabel organized the solution before Robert had finished his morning coffee, and when Clara Briggs had a baby of her own 8 months after Gerald arrived, it was Mabel and Eliza who were there first. The North Pasture Gold operation continued to be carefully managed, and by the 2nd year it was producing consistently enough to have funded several significant improvements to the ranch. Proper repairs to all the bunkhouse roofing, a new stable for the horse program, and a windmill water system that ended the dependency on rainfall that had been the ranch's most persistent vulnerability. Robert had been right about the horses. The string he was developing was attracting serious attention from buyers in San Antonio and as far as Fort Worth, and by the time Gerald was 2 years old, the horse operation was a genuine secondary income that was on its way to equaling the cattle. Mabel bought Ernesto a set of proper cooking equipment from a catalog out of New Orleans, the kind of cast iron and copper he had been making do without, and the cook shack was never the same. The hands ate better than most men in Texas, a fact that contributed substantially to a low turnover rate that Robert credited, in conversations with other ranchers, entirely to good judgment about people, which was true enough. She also kept writing. She had always written letters, ledger entries, notes to herself, but now she began writing a more systematic record of the ranch's operation. What worked, what failed, what the land required in different seasons, how the horse breeding was developing. It was practical writing, the kind a person does to think clearly, but it accumulated into something more than that, a genuine record of a working place and the people who made it work. She wrote a letter to Horace Pemberton in Abilene, informing him that the debt had been settled in full and thanking him for his role in bringing the matter to her attention. She said, at the end of the letter, that she supposed he had done her rather more of a service than either of them had anticipated. He wrote back, in the careful loops of a man who charged by the word, to say that he was very glad to hear it. In the spring that Gerald turned 3, she discovered she was expecting again, and told Robert on a Tuesday evening on the porch in language that was, characteristically, direct and accurate. He sat very still for a moment, and then he smiled slowly, the full smile, and he reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch in the spring evening with the creek running, and the cedar trees moving in the warm wind and the horses in the corral and the whole solid reality of the life they had built. And neither of them needed to say very much because what there was to say was already fully present. Their second child was a girl, born in October, a girl they named Alice Ruth Shelby, and she arrived in the world as if she had a specific and cheerful agenda, red-faced and certain of herself in a way that made Ernesto, when he first saw her, say with quiet conviction that this one was going to be trouble, and he said it with the warmth of a man who considered trouble of the right kind to be a great gift. Gerald at 3 received his sister with a proprietary seriousness, appointing himself her observer and occasional advisor with the grave thoroughness of a child who has never done anything carelessly in his life. Robert watched his son lean over the edge of the cradle to peer at his sister and felt something happen to the inside of his chest that he did not try to classify because it was too large for classification. Mabel saw his face and thought, "This is the man I found at the end of the road I did not know I was taking." She thought about the letter folded so many times the creases had gone white. She thought about the train and the stage and the bay mare and the painted gate. She thought about sitting across a kitchen table from a stranger who had turned out not to be strange at all, about the ledger and the document and the words her father had written that she had not understood until she did. She thought about what it means to go looking for one thing and find that what you were looking for was never the point, that the point was the road and the gate and the man standing in the October light with a horse and a direct look and 3 unanswered letters and enough decency to honor a debt no one was watching him honor. She had come for $800. She had found a man who did not owe her $1 of it in the way that mattered, who had in fact been conducting himself with perfect integrity, while her own family had conducted themselves with silence. She had found a man who owed her nothing she could write in a ledger, and who had given her everything she could never have properly entered there. The partnership, the argument, the laughter in the cold, the honest conversation, the hand held on the porch in the evening, the children with his hair and her eyes and the whole complicated, specific, irreplaceable life of it. The painted gate at the end of the red dirt road still held its running horse. The creek still ran clear over the gold in its bed. The cedar trees still moved in the Texas wind. The limestone house held them all, solid and real, built to last by someone who knew what he was doing, and added to now by someone who had known exactly how to make a good thing better. On a Tuesday in November, 4 years after she had first unfolded a letter at her father's kitchen table in Dodge City, Mabel Conley Shelby sat at the desk in the study of the limestone house, with the fire going and her ledger open, and her children asleep in the next room, and her husband reading by the fire. And she opened the ledger to the page that had once held the entry for $800 lent to a cattle rancher in Sweetwater Creek, Texas. With the word trust beside it in her father's cramped hand, she looked at the entry for a long time. Then she wrote underneath it in her own clear hand a single line, paid in full, and more. She closed the ledger and set down her pen and turned in her chair, and Robert looked up from his book, and they looked at each other across the warm and ordinary room, and that was everything, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly right, and it was all.